The late afternoon sun cast long golden rays over the quiet suburban neighborhood as Sarah pulled into the driveway of her modest home. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders, exhaustion evident in her every movement. As a veterinarian at the local animal shelter, she had witnessed countless cases of neglect and abandonment, each one etching a deeper mark on her heart. But none of it had prepared her for what she would soon encounter. As she stepped out of the car, she noticed a shadow dart across the sidewalk. A dog, a German shepherd, stood at a distance, its lean frame a testament to hunger and hardship. Its fur was matted, and the once proud stature of the breed had given way to a cautious, fearful demeanor. Sarah's heart clenched at the sight. "Hey, there," she said softly, crouching down to make herself less intimidating. The dog flinched, its amber eyes locked onto hers, filled with both desperation and hesitation. For a moment, neither of them moved. The dog's ribs were visible beneath its dusty coat, and Sarah could see the subtle tremor in its legs. It had clearly been on its own for far too long. Slowly, she reached into her bag, pulling out the leftover sandwich she hadn't eaten at lunch. She unwrapped it, tearing a small piece and extending it toward the dog. "Come on, it's okay," she whispered. The shepherd hesitated but took a cautious step forward. Its nose twitched as it sniffed the air. Then, with a tentative motion, it took the offered piece of bread. Sarah stayed still, letting it decide whether to trust her. A few more moments passed, and then the dog took another step closer, swallowing its meal hungrily. "That's a good boy," Sarah murmured, offering another piece. "You must be starving." She could see scars along its legs, some old, some newer, telling stories she could only imagine. Who had abandoned such a noble creature? Had it once belonged to a family? Had it been loved before the streets became its only home? Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, startling the dog. It recoiled, ears flattened, ready to bolt. "It's okay," she reassured quickly, placing the sandwich down before backing up a few steps. The shepherd remained wary but didn't run. Instead, it devoured the sandwich before looking back at her. Sarah sighed. If she left it here, there was no telling what might happen. The streets were unkind, and survival was a daily battle for strays. She made a decision. "All right, buddy. How about we get you somewhere safe?" The road to trust. It took nearly an hour of patience and soft words before the German shepherd allowed Sarah to slip a leash around its neck. The moment it felt the restraint, panic surged in its eyes, but Sarah remained calm, stroking its head gently. "You're safe now," she promised. She led him to her car, speaking soothingly the entire way. The moment she opened the back door, the shepherd hesitated but, after a moment's deliberation, climbed in, curling into the corner of the seat. The drive to her home was silent, save for the soft panting of her newfound companion. She stole glances at him through the rearview mirror. His eyes no longer held the same frantic fear but remained guarded. Whatever he had endured had left deep scars, not just physically but emotionally. Arriving home, Sarah gently guided him inside, offering him a bowl of fresh water and a plate of boiled chicken. The shepherd eyed her cautiously but, hunger overriding his hesitation, he devoured the food within seconds. Sarah chuckled. "I think I'll call you Maximum Strong, noble, just like you." Max's ears twitched at the sound of his new name. It was small, but she took it as a sign of hope. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard soft movements from the living room. Max was restless, circling the couch, unsure whether he was allowed to settle. Sarah grabbed a blanket and walked over, draping it near the couch. "You can sleep here if you want, Maximum. You're safe." For a long moment, he stood there, watching her. Then, as if finally surrendering to exhaustion, he curled into the blanket, letting out a heavy sigh. Sarah smiled. It was a small step, but it was a start. And sometimes, all it took was a little kindness to begin healing a broken heart. The first night was restless. Max stirred often, his ears twitching at every small sound. Sarah lay awake, listening to his quiet movements, understanding that trust wouldn't come easily. She knew better than to force it. So she let him settle in his own way, offering space but never turning away. By morning, Max remained curled on the blanket she had left for him. His eyes flickered open when she approached, wary but not panicked. She crouched down and spoke softly. "Morning, buddy. Hungry?" He didn't move as she placed a fresh bowl of food and water nearby. He simply watched, waiting. Only when she stepped away did he cautiously approach the meal, eating in careful, measured bites. Sarah spent the morning observing him, letting him get used to her presence. Every small movement made him tense, but he didn't retreat. It was progress. After a while, She sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a book, pretending not to notice him. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him watching, his ears perking up slightly. By the afternoon, she decided to test the waters. Grabbing a leash, she knelt a few feet away from him. "Let's try a little walk. No pressure." Max stiffened at the sight of it. His amber eyes flicked between her and the door, calculating. Sarah didn't move any closer. Instead, she placed the leash on the floor between them and leaned back against the couch. Minutes passed. Max lowered his head and sniffed the leash cautiously. Sarah let out a small, encouraging hum but didn't push him further. Another moment later, he took a hesitant step forward. "That's it," she murmured. Slowly, she reached for the leash and, with deliberate gentleness, clipped it onto his collar. Max flinched but didn't pull away. His body remained rigid as she stood and opened the door. The fresh air seemed to soothe him. He took a step forward, then another. Sarah followed his lead, keeping the leash loose. At first, he was hesitant, every sound making him pause. But soon, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath their steps became a steady pattern. A neighbor passed by with their small terrier. Max froze, his muscles tensing. Sarah instinctively crouched beside him, keeping her voice steady. "It's okay. You're okay." The terrier barked, pulling at its leash, but Max didn't lunge or growl. He simply stood there, frozen in place. Sarah gave the leash a gentle tug, urging him forward. "Come on, buddy. Let's keep going." After a long pause, Max moved, following her lead once more. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Back home, she rewarded him with another meal and a soft scratch behind the ear. He didn't recoil this time. Instead, he let out a slow breath and lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging the smallest hint of trust. Sarah smiled. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, she truly believed he would get there. The morning light seeped through the blinds, casting soft rays across the wooden floor. Sarah woke to the sound of gentle movements from the living room. She pulled on a sweater and stepped out of her bedroom, her eyes landing on Max, who was awake and pacing near the couch. His ears perked up at her presence, but he remained wary, still adjusting to his new surroundings. "Morning, Max," she greeted, her voice warm yet cautious. She didn't want to startle him. He watched her carefully, tail flicking slightly, a sign that trust was still a delicate thing between them. She grabbed a bowl and filled it with kibble, setting it on the floor near the couch. Max approached hesitantly, sniffing before finally eating. The fact that he was comfortable enough to eat in front of her was progress. As he ate, Sarah sat down nearby, sipping her coffee. "You know, Max, trust isn't built in a day, but I'm not going anywhere." The sound of the front door opening made Max freeze. He turned his head sharply toward the noise, his body tense, ready to bolt. Sarah's best friend, Emily, stepped inside, carrying a bag of supplies. "Whoa," Emily said, pausing mid-step. "Is this the guy you told me about?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, this is Maximum. He's still getting used to things." Emily crouched slightly, extending her hand, but Max backed away, ears pinned. "He's been through a lot," Sarah explained. "Give him time." Emily nodded, setting the bag on the counter. "I brought some treats and a new collar. Thought it might help." Sarah smiled. "Thanks, Em. I think we'll take it slow." The day passed with small victories. Max started following Sarah at a distance, watching her as she moved about the house. Each time she sat down, he inched a little closer, as if testing the waters. By evening, he lay near her feet, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. That night, Sarah decided to take a leap of faith. She grabbed a spare leash and knelt beside Max. "What do you think, buddy? Wanna try a short walk?" Max eyed the leash, his muscles tightening. Sarah didn't push, only if you're ready. After a few moments, he lowered his head, allowing her to clip the leash to his collar. Relief and excitement washed over Sarah. The walk was slow and cautious. Max stayed close to her side, ears flicking at every sound. Cars, distant voices, even a rustling bush made him pause. But he didn't bolt. He stayed. They passed by a park, where a few children were playing. One little boy, no older than 5, pointed. "Look, Mummy, a doggy." Max froze, eyes wide with alarm. Sarah instinctively placed a hand on his back. "It's okay, buddy. Just a kid." The boy took a step forward, but his mother gently pulled him back. "Not all dogs are ready for pets, sweetheart." Sarah mouthed a grateful thank you before leading Max away. When they reached home, Max let out a long breath as if he'd been holding it the entire walk. "You did great today," Sarah whispered, rubbing his head lightly. For the first time, Max leaned into her touch. That night, instead of curling in the corner, Max walked to Sarah's side as she sat on the couch. He lay beside her feet, his eyes heavy with sleep. Sarah smiled, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but tonight, trust had taken root. Days turned into weeks, and Max was slowly learning to trust. His cautious glances had softened, and he no longer flinched at every sound. He had begun following Sarah more closely, his presence less like a shadow and more like a companion. But there were still challenges ahead. One evening, as Sarah sat on the couch, Max lay beside her, his head resting on his paws. She absent-mindedly stroked his fur, marveling at how far he had come. But she also knew there was one major hurdle they hadn't yet crossed: other dogs. The few times Max had seen another dog on their walks, he had stiffened, his ears flattening, body rigid with fear. Sarah knew that whatever past trauma he carried, it involved other dogs. And if he was going to heal fully, they would need to face that fear together. One Saturday morning, Sarah decided it was time. She reached for Max's leash and knelt in front of him. "What do you say, buddy? Want to meet a new friend?" Max's ears perked, but his eyes remained wary. She clipped the leash to his collar and led him outside, keeping their pace slow and steady. They made their way to a quiet section of the park, where Emily was waiting with her golden retriever, Bailey. Bailey was the opposite of Max, cheerful, tail wagging, and full of boundless energy. He stood beside Emily, his tongue lolling happily. Max, on the other hand, halted several feet away, his body tense. Emily kept Bailey calm, not allowing him to rush forward. "No pressure, Max," she said softly. "We'll take it slow." Sarah knelt beside Max, gently rubbing his back. "It's okay. You're safe." Max's amber eyes darted between Sarah and Bailey, uncertain. His paws remained firmly planted as if he were bracing for something bad. But then Bailey did something unexpected. He turned his body sideways and lowered his head, a universal sign of non-aggression. It was as if he sensed Max's fear and wanted to reassure him. Max's ears flicked, his posture softening ever so slightly. Sarah could feel the shift. Slowly, she stepped forward, encouraging Max to do the same. He hesitated but then took a tentative step. Then another. Bailey wagged his tail but remained still. Max inched forward until they were just a foot apart. He sniffed the air cautiously, and Bailey did the same. Then, in the smallest act of trust, Max lowered his head, allowing Bailey to sniff him properly. Sarah exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. "That's it, buddy. You're doing great." Bailey gave a small play bow, but Max wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, he stood tall, observing, processing. But he didn't run. And that was a victory. Over the next few days, Sarah and Emily continued their meetings, keeping the interactions brief and positive. Max remained cautious, but each time, he relaxed just a little more. Then, one evening, something amazing happened. Sarah was sitting on her porch with Max when Emily and Bailey walked up the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Max stood up, his tail giving the slightest wag. It was barely there, but Sarah saw it. And when Bailey approached, Max didn't retreat. He stepped forward, sniffing his new friend with curiosity rather than fear. Tears stung Sarah's eyes as she whispered, "You did it, Maximum." For the first time, Max had let go of a piece of his past. And in that moment, she knew his heart was healing. As the weeks passed, Max's transformation became more evident. His once cautious steps turned into confident strides, his wary glances replaced with trust. Sarah marveled at how he had come to accept love, not just from her, but from others as well. He and Bailey had formed a quiet companionship, their interactions growing more natural with each passing day. It was as if Max had finally found a place where he belonged. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah decided to take Max on a special outing. They drove to a nearby hiking trail, one that wound through dense forests and opened up to a breathtaking lake. She had read that allowing a dog to explore nature freely could be therapeutic, and she wanted Max to experience that sense of freedom. When they arrived, Max hopped out of the car, his ears perking up at the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. Sarah clipped a long leash to his harness, giving him more room to roam. At first, he walked cautiously, sniffing the ground, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, he began to relax, his tail wagging more freely. Halfway through their hike, they reached a clearing that overlooked the lake. The water shimmered under the morning sun, a perfect mirror of the sky above. Sarah sat on a fallen log, watching as Max took it all in. He stepped to the edge of the water, dipping a paw in, then pulling it back, uncertain. She chuckled. "You've never been in the water before, huh?" she mused aloud. "It's okay. You don't have to rush." Max looked back at her as if seeking reassurance. She patted her lap, inviting him over. He trotted back, resting his head on her knee. Sarah stroked his fur, her heart swelling with gratitude. This moment, this peaceful, quiet moment, was a testament to how far they had come. As they sat together, footsteps approached from behind. Sarah turned to see an elderly man walking with a black German shepherd at his side. The dog was older, its muzzle dusted with grey, but it held a dignified posture. The man noticed Sarah and smiled. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" he said warmly. Sarah nodded. "It really is." The man glanced at Maximum. "That's a fine-looking shepherd you've got there. What's his name?" "Max," she replied, watching as Max perked up, his curiosity piqued by the other dog. The man nodded approvingly. "Good name. My boy here is Duke. He's been my best friend for 12 years. Duke stood calmly beside his owner, exuding the quiet confidence of a dog that had seen the world and trusted it. Max watched him intently, his body language cautious but not fearful. Sarah could see the gears turning in Max's head, as if he recognized something familiar in Duke. After a moment, Max took a step forward, then another. He sniffed the air between them, testing the boundaries. Duke, ever patient, remained still, allowing Max to make the first move. Then, to Sarah's surprise, Max gave a slow, hesitant wag of his tail. The man chuckled. "Seems like your boy is learning to trust again." Sarah smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "Yeah, he really is." The man and Duke continued on their walk, but the moment stayed with Sarah. Max had not only overcome his fear, he had taken the first step toward embracing the world beyond his past. As they made their way back to the car, Max walked beside her, his head held high, his steps light. He no longer carried the weight of his old fears. He had found love, safety, and a place where he belonged. That night, as Sarah settled into bed, Max curled up at her feet. She reached down, scratching behind his ears, and whispered, "You're home now, Maximum. You're safe." Max let out a deep, contented sigh, closing his eyes. And for the first time since she had met him, Sarah knew he believed it, too.